There comes a moment in life when silence is tested, when distance is used as a weapon, when emotional withdrawal is meant to break your spirit. And in that moment, something powerful is revealed. Not about them, but about you. Because when an avoidant personality pulls away, they expect a reaction. They expect chasing. They expect emotional collapse. They expect you to fold under pressure. But what happens when you don't? What happens when you stay calm? When you stay centered? When you don't beg, don't chase, don't panic? That's the moment the game changes. Because for the first time, they realize something terrifying to them. You are not controllable. You are not dependent. You are not emotionally fragile in the way they expected. And that realization doesn't push them away forever, pulls them into awareness. See, avoidant behavior is not about lack of feeling. It's about fear of emotional depth, fear of vulnerability, fear of being needed too much or needing someone else too, deeply. But when they meet someone they can't destabilize, someone who remains grounded even in emotional silence, it creates internal confusion. They expected control. They got stability. They expected pursuit. They got peace. They expected weakness. They found strength. And that strength quietly commands respect. Because now they can't predict you anymore. And what the mind cannot predict, it starts to analyze. What it analyzes, it starts to think about. What it thinks about, it starts to feel drawn to. This is where everything shifts. Not because you changed who you are, but because you stopped reacting like everyone else. You stopped proving your value. You started embodying it. And here's the truth most people miss. You don't win an avoidant by chasing them harder. You win by becoming so emotionally stable that their old patterns no longer work on you. That's when curiosity turns into respect. Respect turns into reflection. And reflection sometimes turns into regret. But even if they never come back, you still win. Because you didn't lose yourself trying to keep someone else. And that is the highest form of emotional power. Avoidant dynamics are built on expectation patterns. At the core, they often assume that emotional distance will create a reaction in the other person. Not just any reaction, but a very specific one, pursuit. When they pull away, go silent, or create emotional space, they are unconsciously or sometimes consciously testing the other person's emotional stability. It is less about cruelty and more about control of emotional intensity. They are trying to regulate their own discomfort by managing the emotional environment around them. So when they expect reaction, what they are really anticipating is proof. Proof that they matter. Proof that they have impact. Proof that the other person is emotionally invested enough to chase, to question, to overthink, to reach out repeatedly. This becomes a feedback loop for them. If the other person reacts strongly, it confirms their internal belief that closeness is overwhelming and that distance is safer. If the other person collapses emotionally, it reinforces their sense of needing control in relationships. Either way, they feel they are in a position of influence. But when that expectation is interrupted, something unusual happens in their internal system. When instead of panic, there is calm, instead of chasing, there is stillness, instead of emotional escalation, there is emotional regulation. The entire pattern they rely on stops working. It's not just unexpected, it is confusing, because their mind is structured around predictable emotional responses. They are used to cause and effect. Withdrawal leads to pursuit. Silence leads to attention. Distance leads to emotional pressure. So when that chain is broken, their internal map of relationships no longer fits reality. This is where your calmness becomes powerful. Not because it is loud or dramatic, but because it is absent of the reaction they depend on. You don't argue against their distance. You don't try to fix it immediately. You don't chase validation. You simply remain emotionally steady. And that steadiness sends a message louder than words. Their behavior is not controlling your state. For an avoidant, this is unfamiliar territory. Because emotional control has often been their protective mechanism. If they withdraw and the other person reacts, they feel safe in their strategy. But if they withdraw and nothing destabilizes, they are forced to confront something uncomfortable. The strategy is no longer producing the expected outcome. And when a strategy stops working, the mind doesn't immediately let go of it studies it. So instead of feeling power, they start to feel uncertainty. Instead of feeling in control, they start to feel curiosity mixed with discomfort. Why didn't you react? Why aren't you chasing? Why aren't you trying to fix the gap they created? These questions don't necessarily lead to immediate emotional openness, but they do create cognitive disruption. Their attention shifts from controlling the situation to analyzing it. That analysis is important because it changes the emotional dynamic without you forcing anything. Your silence becomes data in their mind. Your stability becomes a reference point they are not used to. And slowly, what was once a predictable pattern becomes unpredictable. The absence of reaction becomes more powerful than any emotional reaction could have been. Because where emotion would have confirmed their expectations, calmness challenges them. In that space, they are no longer dealing with someone who can be easily pulled into emotional chaos. They are dealing with someone who remains anchored. And that anchoring is what begins to shift the entire perception of connection, not through confrontation, but through the simple refusal to be destabilized. Most people assume relationships are driven by intensity, big emotions, strong reactions, constant reassurance, and visible passion. But in avoidant dynamics, intensity is not what creates attraction in the long term. In fact, intensity often triggers the very thing avoidants are trying to escape. Their nervous system is not wired to interpret emotional highs as safety. It often interprets them as pressure. So when things become too emotionally charged, their instinct is to step back, create distance, and regulate themselves through separation. That's why stability becomes so powerful in contrast. Stability is not loud. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't escalate. It doesn't force emotional resolution in the moment. Instead, it creates a sense of predictability that feels unfamiliar, but deeply significant to someone who is used to emotional unpredictability. When an avoidant encounters someone who does not fluctuate with their every move, something subtle starts to shift internally. At first, they may not even register it consciously. They might assume the calmness is temporary. They might test it again by pulling back more, saying less, or creating more distance to see if the same emotional reaction appears. This is where stability proves itself. If the response remains consistent, no panic, no over-explanation, no emotional collapse, the brain starts to recognize a new pattern. The usual emotional triggers are no longer producing the expected outcome. This is where stability starts to feel powerful. Not because it is trying to be powerful, but because it is unaffected by destabilizing behavior. The avoidant is used to emotional environments where reactions are immediate and strong. They are used to feeling that their distance has consequences that are visible and emotionally charged. But when they don't see that reaction, their internal expectation begins to weaken. What makes stability so impactful is that it removes emotional urgency from the interaction. There is no pressure to respond instantly. There is no emotional punishment or reward cycle playing out in real time. Instead, there is space. And space is something avoidant individuals are paradoxically drawn to and unsettled by at the same time. They need space to regulate, but when space no longer produces emotional chaos in the other person, it stops feeling like control and starts feeling like uncertainty. In that uncertainty, their attention shifts. They begin to observe rather than react. They notice patterns. They compare past experiences with the present dynamic. They start to recognize that this connection does not behave like previous ones. Where they expected emotional escalation, they find steadiness. Where they expected pursuit, they find patience. Where they expected dependency, they find independence. This contrast is what elevates stability into something far more influential than intensity. Intensity burns fast. It creates emotional spikes, but it also creates exhaustion. Stability, on the other hand, creates memory. It lingers in the mind because it does not demand resolution. It does not create emotional chaos that must be immediately escaped from. Instead, it sits quietly in their awareness, becoming harder to ignore over time. And this is where perception begins to shift. The avoidant starts to associate your presence with emotional safety rather than emotional pressure. Not because you are doing anything dramatic, but because you are not reacting in ways that reinforce their old expectations. The nervous system begins to register you differently, not as a threat to their autonomy, but as a presence that does not destabilize them. That recognition is powerful because it disrupts their internal model of relationships. It introduces the idea that closeness does not have to equal overwhelm. That connection does not have to mean loss of control. And when that idea takes root, even slightly, it changes how they experience you. Not through words or declarations, but through consistency that remains unshaken in moments where they expect. Emotional imbalance. When someone is used to emotional predictability based on reaction, especially an avoidant, dynamics, your unpredictability becomes a psychological shift they can't easily categorize. But this isn't about being inconsistent, chaotic, or emotionally confusing. It's actually the opposite. It's about being consistently grounded in yourself, to the point where their usual assumptions about your reactions no longer apply. Most people in emotionally intense dynamics become easy to read over time. If there is distance, they panic. If there is silence, they chase. If there is confusion, they over-explain. These reactions create a pattern that the other person learns quickly. Avoidant individuals, in particular, become highly attuned to these patterns. They don't just observe emotions, they map them. They learn what button produces what response. And once that mapping is done, the dynamic becomes predictable, even if it is emotionally charged. So when that predictability disappears, something subtle but important happens. You stop fitting into their internal script. They reach out less expecting a familiar reaction and more trying to figure out what version of you will show up. That uncertainty creates cognitive engagement. Not because you are trying to confuse them, but because you are no longer performing the role they assign to you in their emotional framework. This unpredictability is not about playing games or changing personalities. It is about emotional independence. One day you are available and warm, the next you are calm and focused on your own life. Not as a strategy, but as a reflection of someone who is not emotionally regulated by their presence or absence. That creates a gap between expectation and reality. And the mind always tries to close that gap. For an avoidant, this gap becomes especially noticeable because they are used to influencing emotional tone through distance. When distance no longer produces predictable emotional, chasing their sense of control over relational outcomes weakens. They may not admit it or even fully understand it, but they start paying more attention. Not because you are chasing them, but because you are no longer responding in the way they are accustomed to. This is where curiosity begins to replace assumption. Instead of thinking, I know how they will react, they start thinking, why didn't they react the way I expected? That question alone is powerful, because curiosity keeps attention alive. And attention is the first step toward emotional reconsideration. Unpredictability also forces reflection. When someone cannot rely on your emotional response as a constant, they are pushed to observe your behavior more carefully. They start noticing subtleties they previously overlooked. Your tone, your timing, your silence, your calmness, all of it becomes more noticeable because it cannot be easily predicted or dismissed. The mind becomes more engaged simply because it cannot rely on autopilot assumptions. At the same time, this unpredictability creates a form of emotional recalibration. They begin to realize that their previous methods of control, withdrawal, silence, distance are not producing the same emotional outcomes. That realization is subtle, but it disrupts their internal equilibrium. It introduces doubt into a system that previously felt predictable, and once doubt enters, observation increases. Importantly, this does not mean they suddenly become emotionally open or vulnerable. It means their mental engagement with you increases. You become someone they cannot fully categorize, and the human mind is naturally drawn to what it cannot fully define, especially a mind that is used to managing closeness through distance. So your unpredictability is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, steady independence. It is not reacting the way they expect. It is not falling into emotional extremes. It is simply existing outside their control pattern. And that alone makes you harder to ignore, harder to mentally dismiss, and harder to emotionally replace in their internal narrative. When emotional dynamics shift into distance, silence, or uncertainty, most people feel an instinctive need to fill the gap with words, explanations, or emotional pursuit. But in avoidant dynamics, restraint often communicates far more than reaction ever could. Emotional control is not about suppressing feelings, it is about not letting those feelings dictate impulsive behavior. And when you demonstrate that kind of control consistently, something changes in how you are perceived at a very deep level. Respect in emotional dynamics is not always spoken. In fact, the most powerful form of respect is often silent. It is the recognition that the other person cannot be easily destabilized, manipulated, or pulled into emotional chaos. When someone withdraws and expects emotional collapse, but instead meets calm presence, they are confronted with a new form of authoritarian stability. That stability does not need to announce itself. It is visible in how you do not overreact, how you do not chase validation, and how you do not abandon your own emotional center just to restore connection. Avoidant individuals in particular are highly sensitive to emotional pressure, even if they don't always express it directly. They are often scanning for signs of expectation, dependency, or emotional demand. When they sense too much of it, they retreat. But when they sense the absence of emotional pressure even in distance, their internal response begins to shift. They may not move closer immediately, but they begin to register something different in you. That difference is where respect begins to form. Not because you are trying to earn it, but because you are no longer behaving in ways that trigger their defensive patterns. When they pull away and you remain composed, it communicates something powerful. Your emotional state is not dependent on their actions. That realization quietly removes the leverage they thought distance would give them. Over time, this creates a psychological shift. Instead of viewing you as someone who will react predictably, they begin to view you as someone who holds emotional ground. That kind of presence is rare in highly reactive dynamics. Most people unconsciously try to restore connection immediately, even at the cost of their own dignity or emotional balance. But when you do not, it introduces contrast, and contrast forces attention. Respect is often born in contrast. When someone expects emotional instability and instead encounters emotional steadiness, they are forced to reassess their assumptions. They may not articulate it, but internally they begin to register that you are not easily influenced by absence or silence. And that changes the power dynamic not in a manipulative sense, but in a perceptual sense. This emotional control also communicates self-worth without needing to declare it. You are not proving your value through pursuit. You are not negotiating your importance through emotional intensity. Instead, your behavior reflects internal stability, and people naturally respect what does not collapse under pressure. It is not about being cold or detached, it is about being anchored. For avoidants, this anchoring can be both unsettling and compelling. It challenges their expectation that emotional distance will lead to emotional pursuit. When that expectation is not met, they are left with observation instead of reaction. And through observation, they start to notice consistency. They notice that your emotional world does not revolve around their availability. That realization introduces a form of respect that is not forced, it is earned through presence alone. This is why emotional control carries more weight than emotional expression in certain dynamics. Expression without control can be dismissed as reaction, but control under emotional pressure signals depth. It shows that your emotional state is not easily hijacked by external behavior. And that creates a kind of quiet authority that does not need validation from the other person to exist. Over time, this authority reshapes how they interact with you mentally. Even if distance continues, even if silence persists, there is an internal acknowledgement that you are not operating from neediness or instability. And that acknowledgement is where silent respect lives. When someone's usual emotional strategy stops producing the effect they expect, something subtle begins to happen in their mind long before they ever express it outwardly. In avoidant dynamics, emotional distance is often used as a regulator. It creates space, reduces intensity, and allows them to regain a sense of control. But when that distance no longer triggers emotional pursuit, panic, or instability in the other person, the entire mechanism they rely on becomes less effective. And when a mechanism stops working, the mind does not ignore it, it investigates it. This is where curiosity begins to emerge, not as a romantic feeling at first, but as a psychological disruption. The avoidant is used to a predictable pattern, they withdraw, and the other person reacts. That reaction might be emotional, anxious, persistent, or even pleading. Whatever form it takes, it confirms something in their internal model of relationships that distance creates impact. But when they withdraw and receive calm instead of chaos, silence instead of pursuit, or grounded presence instead of emotional escalation, their internal expectations are interrupted. That interruption is important because the mind is not comfortable with unresolved patterns. Humans are naturally driven to make sense of what they cannot immediately explain. So when their usual emotional formula stops working, they begin to observe more closely. Not necessarily because they want closeness, but because they want clarity. Why is this person not reacting the way others have reacted before? What is different here? What changed? This is the beginning of curiosity. And curiosity is powerful because it shifts attention. Attention is no longer based on emotional control, but on analysis. Instead of assuming your reaction, they start monitoring your behavior. Instead of expecting a predictable emotional response, they begin looking for signals, patterns, and inconsistencies. You become something to figure out, not something to push away and forget. For an avoidant, this shift can be subtle but persistent. They may not suddenly reach out with emotional clarity or vulnerability. In fact, they often resist that step initially. But internally, their attention does not fully detach. The absence of expected reaction creates a gap, and that gap draws mental focus back toward you. The mind does not like unanswered emotional equations. When something doesn't resolve in the expected way, it stays active in the background. This is why curiosity often grows quietly. It doesn't always show up as communication. It shows up as thinking, replaying interactions, reevaluating your responses, comparing your behavior in different moments. trying to understand whether your calmness is genuine, strategic, or temporary. These internal questions keep you present in their awareness longer than an emotional reaction would have. Ironically, strong emotional reactions often close the door faster because they confirm the avoidance expectation that closeness leads to intensity and pressure. But calmness leaves the situation open-ended. And open-ended situations are harder for the mind to release. When something feels unfinished, the brain keeps returning to it, searching for resolution. This is where curiosity becomes emotionally significant over time. What starts as analysis can gradually shift into reflection. They begin to notice not just your reaction, but your absence of reaction. Your emotional stability becomes noticeable because it contrasts with what they are used to. And that contrast makes you memorable in a different way, not because of intensity, but because of consistency. Even if they do not immediately act on this curiosity, it creates a mental presence. You become part of their internal dialogue, not because you are demanding attention, but because you are no longer fitting into the expected emotional structure. And anything that disrupts a familiar structure tends to stay in the mind longer than something predictable ever could. Over time, this curiosity can soften rigid assumptions. It does not guarantee reconnection or emotional openness, but it changes the internal narrative. Instead of being dismissed as predictable, you become something worth understanding. And that shift alone alters the emotional landscape between silence and connection, turning absence into ongoing mental engagement rather than closure. Most people misunderstand emotional victories because they associate them with outcomes: who came back, who apologized, who chased, who realized your worth. But in deeper emotional dynamics, especially those involving avoidant patterns, the real victory has very little to do with the other person's behavior. It has everything to do with whether you stayed aligned with yourself when pressure was applied to make you abandon that alignment. When someone withdraws, becomes distant, or emotionally unavailable, it naturally triggers uncertainty. The human mind is wired to seek resolution, to restore connection, and to reduce discomfort. In that space, it becomes very easy to shift focus outward. What are they doing? Why are they silent? How can I fix this? What can I say to bring them back? Slowly, without realizing it, a person can begin to abandon their own emotional center in an attempt to restore the relationship dynamic. That is where emotional loss begins, not when someone leaves, but when you leave yourself. True emotional strength is not measured by how loudly you react or how intensely you pursue. It is measured by your ability to stay intact when nothing around you is responding the way you want it to. When distance is not enough to destabilize you. When silence is not enough to force emotional collapse. When uncertainty is not enough to make you betray your own peace. That is where self-control becomes more powerful than control over any external situation. In avoidant dynamics, this becomes even more significant because the system itself often revolves around emotional push and pull. One person withdraws, the other reacts. One creates distance, the other fills it. One goes silent, the other tries to restore connection. This cycle can continue indefinitely, not because either person is wrong, but because the pattern is unconscious. The real shift happens when one person stops playing their assigned role in that cycle. When you stop reacting in predictable ways, you break the loop. But more importantly, when you stop abandoning your emotional stability just to keep someone else close, you reclaim something far more valuable than their attention. You reclaim yourself. That is not a dramatic moment. It is often quiet. It looks like not sending that extra message, not over-explaining, not chasing clarity from someone who is choosing distance, not turning your emotional state into a reaction to their absence. This is where the real transformation takes place. Because at that point, your decisions are no longer being driven by fear of loss or desire for validation. They are being driven by awareness. You begin to act from a place of internal grounding instead of external dependency. And that shift changes everything about how you experience the situation, even if nothing immediately changes outside of you. Even if the other person never returns, never reflects, or never expresses realization, you are no longer trapped in emotional instability. And that is the highest form of victory because it is not conditional. It does not depend on their behavior. It does not depend on closure from them. It does not depend on being chosen, understood, or validated. Self-control in this context means you did not allow someone else's avoidance to turn you into someone you are not. You did not allow distance to make you desperate. You did not allow silence to make you lose self-respect. You did not allow uncertainty to make you emotionally reactive in ways that compromise your dignity. Instead, you observed, you regulated, and you stayed anchored in your own worth. That is why this kind of victory is lasting, because external outcomes can change at any moment. Someone can come back, leave again, apologize, or stay silent indefinitely. But your internal stability remains yours. Once you develop the ability to stay emotionally centered under pressure, you carry that strength into every future situation. And in the end, that is what defines true emotional power, not how much control you had over someone else's behavior, but how much control you maintained over your own. In the end, everything about this dynamic comes down to a single truth that most people only realize after emotional exhaustion has already taken its toll. You were never meant to win someone by losing yourself. You were never meant to prove your worth through pursuit, anxiety, or emotional collapse. And you were never meant to shrink your identity just to keep someone comfortable in their distance. The real turning point is when you stop interpreting their withdrawal as a challenge to your value and start recognizing it as a reflection of their capacity for connection, not a measurement of your worth. That shift alone changes everything because it moves you out of reaction and into awareness. When an avoidant realizes they cannot break you emotionally, they may feel a sense of relief and hope that you will eventually move on. What actually changes is not their behavior at first, but the internal map they use to understand relationships. They expected a certain response pattern chasing, emotional urgency, instability, but instead they encounter composure, silence, and grounded presence. That disruption forces a quiet recalibration in how they perceive you. Not because you demanded it, not because you explained yourself, but because you remained consistent when inconsistency was expected. And in emotional dynamics, consistency under pressure is rarely ignored for long. But even beyond their realization, the most important transformation is yours. Because at some point, you stop making your emotional state dependent on external validation or response. You stop measuring your worth through someone else's availability. You stop letting silence dictate your actions. And in doing so, you step into a level of emotional independence that cannot be easily shaken. This is where your power becomes internal rather than relational. You are no longer waiting for clarity from someone else to feel stable within yourself. There is also a deeper understanding that develops with time. Not everyone is capable of meeting you where you stand emotionally, and that is not a reflection of your inadequacy, but of their limitation in handling depth, closeness, or emotional responsibility. Some people retreat not because you are too much, but because they are not equipped for consistency. And when you stop personalizing that retreat, you free yourself from unnecessary emotional struggle. You begin to see distance for what it is instead of what fear tells you it means. Ultimately, what remains after all the emotional noise settles is clarity. Clarity about your value, clarity about your emotional boundaries, and clarity about the kind of connection you will no longer abandon yourself to maintain. Whether they return, reflect, or remain distant becomes secondary. What becomes primary is that you stayed aligned with yourself when it would have been easier not to. And that is where real emotional strength lives, not in changing someone else, but in refusing to be changed into someone you are not just to be accepted. Thank you for taking the time to stay with this message and go through it with focus and presence. Real growth doesn't come from just hearing ideas, it comes from reflecting on them and applying them where it matters in your own life. If this resonated with you, carry it forward not as emotion, but as awareness. Because awareness is what changes patterns, not reaction. Wishing you strength, clarity, and emotional control in every situation you face ahead.